everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Kayla McCulley, class of 2009, and I'm the Director of Alumni Learning and Career Programs. And I know I, for one, have really been enjoying this session. I definitely related to Bernie's misery in economics and statistics class. As an IR major, I think I got straight C's in all of my econ classes. So I'm delighted that you all are joining us this morning for such a special program featuring alumni stories, insights, and the lives of purpose that these award winners have lived. We continue this symposium with our next Blaisdell Distinguished Alumni Award winner, Cruz Reynoso, class of 1953. Reynoso began his career in private law practice in El Centro, California, and subsequently accepted positions in public service, first as the Assistant Director of the California Fair Employment Practice Commission and Secretary to Governor Pat Brown, and later as Associate General Counsel of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Washington, D.C. He returned to California 1 year later to head the California Rural Legal Assistance, and in 1972 he joined the faculty of the University of New Mexico School of Law. In 1976, he was appointed Associate Justice for the California Court of Appeals, and 6 years later, he was elevated to the California Supreme Court, where he served with distinction until 1987. Justice Reynoso again entered private practice until he joined the UCLA Law faculty in 1991, and then continuing his academic career, the UC Davis School of Law welcomed him as the inaugural holder of the Bouchever and Bird Chair in 2001. Reynoso's commitment is to public service. He has served as the Vice Chair for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the Select Commission on Immigration and Human Rights, and the California Post-Secondary Education Commission. In recognition for his service, Justice Reynoso was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by former President Clinton in 2000, and the Hispanic Heritage Foundation Award in Education that same year. He has a number of honorary degrees and serves on the board of several civil rights, environmental, and educational organizations. He has also received the UC Davis Distinguished Public Service Award in 2002 and the UC Davis Medal, as well as an honorary degree from Pomona College. Today, Reynoso is joined by senior Kelly Ragsdale. Kelly is a history major at Pomona. She's worked extensively with Reynoso on his biography and life story, an exploration that began as a summer undergraduate research project here in 2016. And actually, Kelly was telling me that their families live not far apart from each other in UC Davis. Please join me in welcoming Cruz Reynoso and Kelly Ragsdale.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, as was just stated, I've been able to get to know Justice Reynoso quite well over the past few years, and also the pleasure of having him as a neighbor. And so I'm very excited to get to share him with all of you as well. And so my first question is, reflecting on, as you're back on campus and reflecting on your time at Pomona, what are some memories, friendships, or experiences you look back on fondly?
In terms of Pomona?
Yes.
Well, the first thing I should mention to you is that I wasn't sure I was coming to Pomona. I went to a community college, so fortunately I had a scholarship so that I could come to Pomona, and that's what brought me to Pomona. Once in Pomona, I majored in history, which was always a matter of interest to me, and enjoyed then. I had, as I mentioned, attended a community college already, so I was at Pomona only two years, and so then enjoyed very much the classes, the professors, the students at the campus, and graduated in 2 years.
Very nicely done. Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing that as well. Can you speak a little bit about any of your classes or the workload that you had when you were here? Do you remember any of those?
Well, the workload is always heavy. One of my memories is spending all Saturday hiding away, being sure that I caught up with all of my reading, either in my history courses or in my Spanish courses. Even though I speak Spanish, I wasn't that fast a reader in Spanish, so it took me a long time to go through all the books and articles that we had to prepare to then discuss in class. So one of my memories is spending a lot a lot of Saturdays all day long preparing.
Right. Well, I can assure you that we continue that tradition here, so the workload is quite
I would have
heavy.
thought you'd gotten over that.
No, I wish. No, and so now shifting to kind of your career, as was mentioned, you've worked as a lawyer, the director of the California Rural Legal Assistance, a law professor, a California Supreme Court justice, just to name a few. What has been your favorite position you have held?
Well, in some ways, it's hard for me to say, though I have to combine that, I suppose, with the position that has more power, and that's the Supreme Court. So in many ways, I have to say that I enjoyed that more than other positions, largely because what we then wrote had an impact on the people of California.
Right, yeah. And can you maybe talk about one of your favorite cases that you had to decide while you were working, sitting on the court?
Well, one that always comes to my mind is a case having to do with interpreters, where the law required that there be an interpreter for a witness who did not speak English. And in fact, an interpreter was called by the trial court judge, but then for reasons unknown on the record, the interpreter was dismissed by the judge, and that came to our court. Well, it seemed to us on the Supreme Court that due process, constitutional due process, requires that a person know exactly what's going on in court. Thus, for example, if you have a witness, or particularly an accused in the criminal cases, that doesn't understand English, you have a constitutional requirement to have an interpreter. Due process requires that, and so in the case that I mentioned, we made sure that in fact those constitutional requirements were met.
Right. Yeah. And so, from advocating for fair mail delivery for Mexican American families when you're just 11 years old in your community,
I was a troublemaker.
to receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2000, you have been a lifelong advocate for social change. What advice would you give students and young people fighting for justice today?
Basically, to not give up. Those fights are not easy. People are used to doing things in certain ways, and they will continue doing them, I think, until they're educated to do otherwise. That is, to treat their neighbors in a more fair way. So for those who are trying to change basically our society, which is difficult, my main message is not to give up, to keep doing what they think our society should look like, even though it's difficult, very difficult to change a society. But without a group of folk interested in changing that society to a more ideal society, it won't happen.
Right, yeah, thank you. And how has the role of the court changed since you served as a justice? And how do you think, or how do you view the role of the court in the current political climate?
My own
sense. It's a little tricky. That's a tough one.
Yeah. My own sense is that the courts have actually continued to do the type of job that they are meant to do, because there's so many things that happen in society that don't comport to due process, don't comport to fairness, and I think the courts have actually continued in the cases that come before them to insist that be part of the way we as citizens deal with one another.
Yeah. So you have faith that the courts will kind of maintain their independent jurisdiction?
I think so. I think the courts have done actually a pretty good job in that, which means that the governor has been quite careful, the governors, plural, have been quite careful in whom they appoint to the judiciary. Mm-hmm. Because of the importance of the role that they play.
Yeah. Well, you touched upon the phrase troublemaking a little bit earlier, and I know that in the past you've referred to yourself as a troublemaking lawyer, and I was wondering...
I was even a troublemaking citizen before I became a lawyer.
Yes. And I was wondering if you could share with the audience what you kind of mean by that phrase.
Well, society isn't always doing the things that it should do. And it doesn't appreciate somebody pointing that out. That's the troublemaker.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm afraid that I've been a troublemaker all of my life.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. And I think we have quite a bit of time to open it up to questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free.
No questions? Don't worry, I won't bark at you. Yes, did I see a hand over here?
I think we have it over there.
Could you talk to the interplay between the U.S. Supreme Court and then the state Supreme Courts? Like, in terms of jurisdiction, I'm very confused as a member of the electorate, like who's in charge for what? And that's a big topic, but broadly, how do they interact with each other?
Well, of course, and speaking of the more serious cases that go before them, the U.S. Supreme Court would be dealing with matters that deal with a country. There are some matters that deal only with a state, and in those cases, the most important court actually is the state Supreme Court. Thus, for example, if you have a statute that was passed by the legislature, and the statute seems to pass constitutional muster, federal constitutional muster. Nonetheless, there may weaknesses in that statute in terms of the California Constitution. So the judges then have to look at that too. So it depends on the issue that comes before the courts, and these issues come both before the state Supreme Court and the federal Supreme Court. Then the judges have to take those matters into account and make the decision. So sometimes it's not that easy.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as a judge, how do you deal with the process of wrestling with your obligation to sort of read to the law, and you have your own personal opinions as a troublemaker of how society should be and where we should be heading?
I hope that my troublemaking tendencies are tied to proper constitutional mandates. So the answer to your question then is that you have to examine them and be mindful. I think that judges do use their intuition. It's not just the law, and as a person, you have to examine what your own feelings are about a statute that has been passed, for example, and then use your own intuition to then try to see whether if you feel uncomfortable with a statute, and that's your intuitive reaction. Of course, that's not enough. Then you have to examine whether your intuitive reaction also has a constitutional portion to it, and if it does, then you operate in terms of the latter, not the former, in terms of any opinion that you as a judge make. And if you're on the Supreme Court, say of California, hopefully a majority of the judges will agree with you, and then you'll issue that opinion that will then be binding on the California legislature. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, when you talk about the politics of appointing a justice, it seems to me that the state courts are less politically motivated in their appointments than federal courts. So I wondered if you could address the issue of the appropriateness of, well, let me backtrack a bit. In the last election, a lot of the emphasis of who you voted for was that the president would be able to shape the federal courts. So I wondered if you could talk about the appropriateness of having left one of the Supreme Court positions vacant for a long time in order to allow the next president to make the appointment when it, in fact, rendered the court split and not being able to move forward on a lot of issues.
I guess my reaction would be that if one has confidence in the person that has been named by the president in terms of who she or he will appoint to the U.S. Supreme Court, and you have confidence in that, in the person that's projected to be appointed, then you wouldn't have to worry about it. If, on the other hand, you have real concern about that person, assuming that she or he gets confirmed for the U.S. Supreme Court, if you have concerns, then it seems to me that you have a responsibility to speak to the governor and to other folk who have influence in the state appointment of justices to the California Supreme Court to assure that the people of California will be protected by the rulings of the California Supreme Court. So it gets a little bit complicated because of the relationship, of course, of the national to the state courts, but I think that would have to be the approach that would have to be taken.
Would you comment on your perhaps hardest decision?
Well, where is
She's
the
over
mic?
there,
Oh, way back there.
Way back there. Would you comment on perhaps the hardest decision or the one that made you the most proud in your years on the Supreme Court?
Well, we have so many hard decisions that it's hard for me to isolate one. In terms of a case that made me proud of the court and my own role in it, had to do with the respect that the judges and the courts must give to the people who make presentations in testifying before a court. No court, practically every case that comes into the court system is a matter of conflict. And so then to be sure that you're going to have a good result, it seems to me that the judge is going to have a good result. She or he must hear the proper witnesses. And a witness generally is not required to go forward and testify. So it seems to me that the most important thing is to have an atmosphere, an ambiance, that folk are not afraid or reluctant to testify, so that the judge then, or the jury, if there's a jury, will have a full hearing in the case. Since folk are not required to testify, it means that you have to have the proper atmosphere for them to be willing to testify.
We have time for one more question. Did I see a hand up front? I had a hand up for a similar question to that which was answered, which was, to rephrase it a little bit, what would be a couple of matters that you were most pleased that you were able to prevail, I guess, not as an attorney, but as the judge, in a matter of concern to you personally, or a matter that concerned your values?
There was a complicated case that came up once that had to do with the rights of individuals to their own property. Because at common law, there are ways in which an individual can lose his or her property because of common law rules that have come up. For example, even though the property may be used, if another person is using the property without your permission that is adverse to you, after a while, they're actually entitled to that property. That's old law from England that was adopted in this country. So it seems to me that what we have to do is be sure that anybody that may end up in this situation early on understands the consequences of it, which sad to say, I think means that they have to know that there's a danger and therefore consult with a lawyer, because most citizens don't know that. So in a way, it's a matter of each person at least recognizing when there's a danger to one of their interests, in this case, their own property. So it's not easy, but law has never been easy.
Is that all?
Well, if there are no further questions, oh, sorry, one more up front.
Thank you. Justice Reynoso, we talk a lot about increasing diversity in many institutions and, of course, in our courts. And you had mentioned earlier about the use of intuition in making decisions. If we have increased diversity, and when we think of that, we think of racial diversity, gender diversity, for instance, and maybe other experiential diversity. When we have increased diversity on that level, does that enhance automatically or assume to increase the diversity in our intuition? And also, can you kind of speak to the other position that maybe intuition should have no place in judicial decisions, and whether that's even achievable to ignore intuition in that respect?
Well, I think we have. I think the issue that you raise is so important that we have to try, even if we don't always succeed, and that means that we have to try to have diversity by sex, by race, by ethnicity on the courts. That means that we have to have. I think we need to have diversity in terms of how the courts make decisions. That means, in turn, that we need diversity among the legal profession. So unless you have that type of diversity in the important agencies that deal with justice, I'm not sure that we can really have the type of justice that we would want in this country or in the state of California. And those things are not easy. For example, when I went to law school, I still have a photograph of the graduates. I think that was at Berkeley, and at that time the law schools were a lot smaller than they are now. I think the photograph shows something like 50 graduates. Guess how many were women? One. Now that was a long time ago. Then I have a photograph of the graduating class just 2 or 3 years ago. Guess how many were women? A majority. So we actually have more women now in law school than we have men. So it's interesting how these things change. On the other hand, the role of a lawyer has not changed, whether you're a man or a woman. So often women have been excluded from professions by saying, well, that's a man's job. Well, in fact, most of the work that we have can be done both by women and men. So I personally have been pleased to see that in the legal profession we have that sort of diversity. In fact, right now there's a slight majority of the law students in the major law schools that are female. So things have taken a long time to change, but they are indeed changing.
Well, please join me in giving a round of applause.
Thank you.
And I just want to say, Cruz, it has been such a joy to get to know you over the course of the past 2 days, and your son, Len, who followed in your footsteps to forge his own path in the legal field. And Kelly as well. I know she just completed her history thesis presentation yesterday and was still able to do this. So let's give them all a hand.
And it's good to be back at Pomona.
Yes, and another quick break, and then we'll move on to our third and final session featuring Esther Brimmer.
Here, I can turn your mic off. There we go. You're on mic. Yep.
You got it? Yeah. Okay.
So she'll be here, right?